few months back, I published a book in New York, which Tom mentioned is called The Mystery of the Shroud of Turin, New Scientific Evidence. And I've been involved for many years, 20 really, in personally studying the Shroud, and about 8 years ago decided to really begin writing because I had the opportunity to meet so many of the scientists and historians that had studied the Shroud firsthand. And this culminated a few months ago, as you mentioned, in the opportunity to go to Turin to attend a 3-day scientific and historical symposium where I met colleagues from really all over the world. And it really, it culminated in the opportunity to see the Shroud firsthand, which was on a very special exhibit, which we're going to talk about. And I can tell you that no matter what you study, when you stand there right before the Shroud, believing what I believe and knowing what I knew, it was just an awesome experience that you just can't match. Just standing a few feet away from images that I believe to be those of our Lord and the actual blood stains right in front of us. So when I returned, I was invited by Bishop Robert Lynch, who's the Bishop of the Diocese of St. Petersburg, to begin doing lectures. And the interesting part about that was from that a number of Protestant churches had also invited me, and I found that the subject of the Shroud was an extremely ecumenical one because it belongs to everyone. It's not Catholic, it's not Protestant. We even had many of our Jewish colleagues come, and several of the scientists involved in the Shroud are Jewish, and there's really a very unique fascination, as I hope to point out tonight. So the difficulty was, how do you take 20 years of research and writing and condense it into an hour? But I think we've done that. For the past few months, because the Shroud was on a very unique exhibit this past year, which is now over, but because it was on exhibit, there was a lot of media attention. And the attention, just as an example, there was a front page article in the New York Times a few months ago, which I thought gave a very balanced view as opposed to the way the Shroud was treated about 10 years ago when the carbon tests were done, and we're going to have a lot to say about carbon at the end. So this was an article in the New York Times that was very positive. There was a front page article in Time magazine in April. That's the image of the face. It was a little hard to make out, I guess, from that distance, but this was also a very positive article. There was an article in People magazine on Ian Wilson, who was an Oxford historian of the Shroud. And I like to joke, but the most authoritative article was given to me a few weeks ago at St. Luke's Church, not St. Luke's here, came out in the Publix on the authenticity of the Shroud right after the Loch Ness monster that attacked the scuba diver. So, but there's been interest at all levels. There have been a number of television documentaries also. And part of the reason for that is that beside the fact that the Shroud was on exhibit this year, there's been a rather dramatic change in thinking about the Shroud in the last 3 or 4 years because of some new studies, not only with carbon-14, but with pollen, with blood and DNA analysis and whatever. And we're going to get into all that tonight. So I think you'll find that it is a subject of great interest to the media. As Tom mentioned, we are working on a made-for-television documentary. We're in the early stages of that now for the year 2000. The first thing I want to mention is just to give a working definition of the Shroud. What exactly is the Shroud of Turin? The Shroud is a piece of linen cloth which measures 14 feet 3 inches long by 3 feet 7 inches wide, and it's woven in a very unique weave which we call a 3/1 herringbone weave. And the significance of both of those, I'll get into this in a moment, the significance of both of those is that one of the first things we look for is what is the consistency of the cloth itself with what we know of ancient loom technology and ancient what we call metronomics, measurement systems and whatever. The significance is that 3/1 was not the most common weave of the time. That would be 1/1. 3/1 was consistent with a much wealthier fabric. And in the New Testament, it very clearly talks about the fact that the Shroud, which is called a sindon in the New Testament Greek, was purchased by Joseph of Arimathea. And in the next sentence in the New Testament it says, and Joseph was a wealthy man. So we would expect to find a cloth consistent with that, which we do. Secondly, as far as metronomics, 14 by 3 and 3 by 7 seems like an odd measurement to us, but in ancient Palestine and in Syria, in Egypt, Babylon, whatever, the common unit of measurement was a cubit, which is basically about 21.6 inches by our standards. So if you took this cloth and translated it into cubits, it's really 2 cubits by 8 cubits. So the odd measurements to us are very common measurements in the ancient period. The shroud is currently located in the Cathedral of John the Baptist, which is located in the city of Turin, about 400 miles north of Rome at the foot of the Alps. And normally it is kept in a silver, actually a wooden reliquary plated with silver, and normally it was kept in this altar, which is called the Guarini Chapel. And I say normally because 1 year ago, in April of '97, there was a rather substantial fire in the cathedral, and you'll see from the next slides, I think, this whole chapel burned down. The dome of the cathedral was very severely damaged, and, well, this is the cathedral a few months ago. If you go one more slide, I'll just show you. Yeah, the cathedral's being rebuilt, but fortunately the Turin Fire Department was able to rescue the shroud itself. The shroud had suffered some very serious damage in the year 1532, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But in this particular fire, fortunately, it was not hurt. When the shroud was on exhibit, for reasons that I'll get into shortly, one of the concerns that we had, we meaning the group of scientists and historians around the world that had watched previous developments, such as, for example, the vandalism that occurred with Michelangelo's Pieta when that was on exhibit in Rome, I forget, maybe 10 years ago, and a tourist was able to attack the statue and break the marble nose. We've always been concerned about the security of the shroud because sometimes the Turin authorities are a little more in protecting the cloth from what we feel is potential vandalism, even terrorism, and certainly environmental damage whenever you're dealing with a very ancient cloth of this nature. So fortunately now, when the shroud is on exhibit, as it was from April, May, and June of this past year, it is behind a bulletproof glass, rather thick bulletproof glass, and it is now in an inert argon gas to prevent atmospheric damage to the linen because the image is fading. To continue my definition, on the cloth today, this 14-foot 3-inch cloth, we see the images of a man, and I'll say a man, we'll define him as we go through, who appears to be, number one, laid out in an attitude of death consistent with the Jewish style of burial, and number two, who appears to have been the victim of a very, very severe beating and a crucifixion in the Roman classical style of crucifixion. And we're going to go through each of these. Also on the cloth today, because of a very serious fire that I mentioned in the year 1532, where parts of the shroud were damaged, you'll see shortly. You will see some scorch marks going up and down where the cloth was actually folded. You'll see patches from repairs done in the year 1532, and you'll see some water stains. So all these things are apparent. But mainly on the shroud, the fascination comes from the presence of these straw-colored, what we call sepia yellow images on this yellowing ivory cloth. Normally the shroud doesn't go on exhibit very often, maybe once every 30 years. And yet it was on exhibit in 1978, it was on exhibit this year, 1998, and it will be on exhibit again in the year 2000, and we'll have more to say about that later. The reason why it was on exhibit this past year is that this year marks a very special anniversary in the history of the shroud, because 100 years ago, the very first photographs of the shroud were permitted to be taken And photography at that point was a very young science. And an amateur photographer, actually by the name of Secondo Pia, was allowed to take 2 photographs of the Shroud, and his photographs really triggered almost 100 years now of serious interest by the scientific community because of what they found. But essentially, if you look at the Shroud today with the naked eye, this is what you see. It's a yellowing ivory cloth with the sepia straw-colored images. You see the frontal image of a man, you see the back of the head, and the back images down to the sole of the foot. And when he took his first photographs and he went into the darkroom, what absolutely stunned him was that the image that came out was what we see on the right. And it actually is a positive image instead of the negative that he expected, which told him that the image that we're looking at on the Shroud is a perfect negative, which when photographed becomes a positive. Conversely, what we'll identify later, but the bloodstains on the Shroud, such as here on the wrist and in many, many areas, which are positive on the Shroud, when photographed became negative. This was a tremendous puzzlement to all the scientists of the time, and still is today. And that really created the interest in the scientific community to try to understand, what are we actually looking at? What created these images? Is this real blood? Many, many other questions. But since 1998 marks the 100th anniversary, the Turin authorities decided to allow it to be exhibited for 2 months. Now, in 1978, a team was selected to do the first really in-depth scientific investigation of the Shroud. It's called STURP, which stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And the significant thing about the STURP group was that it was composed of about 35 scientists from a variety of disciplines and from a variety of faiths, so that there were a number of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and even several agnostics. It's interesting knowing these men and women, how many of them have changed as a result of this study and converted to a belief in Jesus as a result of it. But again, you decide that for yourself when you see the evidence. But in 1978, what happened was the team was allowed to spend 5 days handling carefully in non-destructive testing of the cloth. One of the first tests that was done by Dr. Max Frey, the late Dr. Max Frey, who was a Swiss criminologist whose severe was botany, and he would solve crimes through the use of botany. And he was allowed to take surface debris samples through sticky tape methods. He was really looking for certain things, among them pollen. When he did his sampling of the Shroud and he began his investigation, he was able to identify some 58 species of pollen on the Shroud. More have been found since that point. But the interesting point was that when Dr. Frey took these pollen and he laid them out on a geographical grid, which was his objective, he noticed that the majority of the pollen came from the area around Jerusalem. And a secondary major grouping of pollen came from an area about 400 miles north of Jerusalem in a city, an ancient city that we now identify as Edessa, and I'll have more to say about Edessa later. He didn't understand the significance of Edessa. He just said that I find a major grouping of pollen from what he called the Anatolian steppe around this area of ancient Edessa in Turkey. The third grouping came from the city of or the area around Constantinople, which is modern Istanbul. And the fourth grouping of pollen really came from France and Italy, where we have a known history of the Shroud for the past 450 years. But he really didn't understand the significance of it. He just said, this is what I find. What he found most interesting was that many of the species that he was able to identify from the area in Jerusalem, he said, came from plants some of which were now extinct and would have existed only in an ancient period. Well, for a while, Dr. Frey's findings were not accepted by everyone, but a major breakthrough came about, I would say 2 years ago, when the Department of Botany at Hebrew University in Jerusalem asked for permission to study these pollen. And Dr. Avinoam Danin, who's the chief of botany at Hebrew University, was able to take the pollen and basically perform the same testing. He met us. We had been corresponding. He's really a fascinating man. And he came to the Turin conference to address everyone. That's Professor Danin right there. And he said that as really the head of botany for Hebrew University, what his conclusion was, and he said, I have to separate myself from the issue of Jesus for a moment, because obviously he's representing Hebrew University, but he said, I can tell you from my studies that there is no question that this is in fact an ancient cloth. Consistent with the floral images from ancient Jerusalem, he said, I'll go a step further and say that we find on the shroud today, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself, but we find on the shroud today that there are some floral images around the head of Jesus that you can see with enhanced contrast photography, mostly black and white photography. And he said that unquestionably flowers had been placed on the shroud, which left pockets of pollen, much of which, from the flowers that were on the shroud, not only came from a 10-kilometer area around Jerusalem, but were flowers that would be consistent with blooming in the spring of the year, March, April, May, in that area, which would be consistent with the time of the Passion and the Passover. Now, coming from Hebrew University, that carried a lot more weight than coming from the Sturp team, although both of them carried the weight. So that was a kind of a real new breakthrough, is to have that reinforcement that the cloth indeed was an ancient cloth, just from the study of the pollen. An example, this is one of the plants that he identified. This is what they call the pistachia plant, and you can see images of this on the off-body images of the cloth with contrast photography. The chrysanthemum was something that had been noticed by an American scientist at Duke University, Dr. Alan Wanger, who was one day studying the off-body areas and noticed what he thought was the image of a chrysanthemum about 15 centimeters to the side of the head. And with enhanced photography, Danin said, yes, that in fact is the image of an ancient chrysanthemum. So it really kind of added tremendous credibility to what Sturp had found in 1978. But when Sturp continued their studies, and they were really using a number of instruments, the electron microscope for one, infrared, ultraviolet fluorescence, and a variety of ways, several other microscopic items were discovered. So, for example, they were able to identify several ancient mites, little insects, which were found on the backing of the cloth, and very consistent with what we find in Egyptian burial cloths also, ancient insects. They also discovered, noted that on the tip of the nose and on the left knee and on the heel of the left foot, embedded in the fibers of the shroud, were samples of dirt, actual dirt embedded into the fibers, which he said were very consistent with a fall. And again, we'll get into that when we talk about the crucifixion. And the last microscopic thing that I'll just mention here is that was discovered by Dr. Eugenia Natowski, and she's an American archaeologist in Utah, who is one of the foremost authorities on the cave tombs of Jerusalem, which were the tombs consistently used in burials in the Jerusalem area. When she was in the cave tombs, she kept noticing that on her khakis, she would have this white powder, which wound up, when she sent it back to the Hercules labs in Colorado in the United States, was identified as calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate is really a limestone dust, which is very consistent with the limestone dust of the cave tombs of Jerusalem. And I should say consistent with calcium carbonate that we find on the backing of the shroud. And it's not just calcium carbonate, it's a particular type called travertine argonite. So it really, although you can't say that means it had to be in that tomb, it was one more piece of evidence that said this is very consistent with its presence in the ancient cave tombs of Jerusalem. Now, most of the focus of the STURP team in 1978, and I would say even since then, has been on the study of the blood and the study of the images, and what actually constitutes these images, and is this real blood? And part of the criticism before 1978 by those who really debunked the shroud was that, well, this is iron oxide, pigment or paint applied to the shroud. These images were painted images. But I can tell you now that those theories have all been dispelled. In essence, what happened when they began the study of the shroud, and they really used three methods, well, I used several, but three that I'll mention here. One was the electron microscope, as I mentioned, to really analyze the fibers to see what constituted the image. One was what we call translucence, where they backlit the shroud to see what light would be blocked and what light would pass through and what might be blocking it. And one was the X-ray and ultraviolet fluorescence, where they were attempting to irradiate the shroud with fluorescence, with X-rays, to see if there were any particles that would fluoresce and tell us what might have constituted any substance on these fibers. So the first thing they noted let me just talk about the difference between, that's a blood image, that's the fiber image. First thing they noticed was that the blood was what we would call a penetrating phenomenon. It saturated the shroud, it went through, it could, in some areas, could be seen on the other side. Whereas one of the first things they noticed with the image was that the fibers that constitute the image that we see of the body were what we call a purely surface phenomenon. They did not penetrate more than 2 or 3 fibrils of the fibers of the shroud. It was a purely surface, non-penetrating phenomenon. The fibers did not cohere to each other. There was no sign of any pigment, any paint, any ink, dye. There was no substance which they could identify which constituted the image. So the question was, well, then what are we actually looking at? And the best thing, for example, Dr. John Jackson, who's a physicist in Colorado, would say that the best way they could identify it was that it was most similar to a scorch. And it represented not something that was applied to the fibers of the shroud, but something that was removed. And he uses an example: if you were to take an iron, a hot iron, and apply it to a piece of linen, given the right time, the right temperature, you would, in essence, you would see a scorch mark very similar to what we see on the shroud. The question being, well, what constitutes? What are we actually looking at? And he would say that what we are looking at is that something happened, a process that no one really exactly knows, but we have theories which we'll talk about later, that rapidly dehydrated, oxidized, and degraded the cellulose of that shroud, of the linen of the shroud, and created the surface phenomenon. And artists who have looked at it, and many of them, Isabel Pixek is a very good example. She's a world-renowned artist who's a very strong advocate of the shroud and of the fact that this was not an artistic creation of any type. Says that you will see no brushstrokes, no directionality, no outline, which she calls the horizon event of art. You will see no cohesion of fibers. You will see nothing, no style of any period that would constitute the work of an artist. Another interesting general factor was that when they looked at the blood versus the image, they stated that the blood had been on the shroud prior to whatever created the image took place, because the blood interfered with the image formation process. Now, what that told the artist was that no artist would take a 14-foot piece of cloth, put blood in the perfect anatomical positions, as the pathologist will see later, and then paint around that or do something. It just would make no sense from an artistic point of view. The blood was on the shroud before the image. The blood saturated, the image did not. When they began to focus on the blood, one of the Dr. Walter McCrone, who was a microscopist, had made the statement, well, this is an iron oxide, and I think at this point, I don't know anyone else who really would agree with that, but when they began to analyze it, one of the first comments that was made, and it was made by a medical examiner in New York, Dr. Michael Baden, who was, I'm not sure if he still is, but he was the medical examiner in New York City. He made the comment that the blood appeared to be a little redder than he would expect ancient blood to look. Well, that was a while ago, and I think that whole, again, another one of those positions that has changed because the blood studies have been rather intense in the past few years. The question that he had, that Dr. Baden had, was answered by two other scientists, Dr. Alan Adler, who was a chemist at Western State University, and one of the Jewish members of the team, and the late Dr. John Heller from the New England Institute. They began to examine the blood chemically. And the first thing that Dr. Adler pointed out was that he was really surprised with the high level of pigment bilirubin which he found in this substance, which some people were claiming was iron oxide. And he said that this would be very consistent with someone who had been under enormous stress and anxiety, as we certainly know Jesus to have been at the time. Well, a couple of years ago in Australia, another DNA specialist, actually a specialist in ancient DNA, Dr. Thomas Loy, who's with Queensland University, said that he has blood samples which are 300,000 years old, never mind 2,000 years old, that are still red, and he attributes it also to high levels of pigment bilirubin. And he said that his conclusion was, or is, that it's not necessarily when a person died, but how they died that could constitute the coloration of the blood. So that seemed to get over one hurdle. Further studies on the blood in the past few years have shown that it can be typed as a type AB, which is very common in the Middle East. At the University of Texas Health and Science Center, Dr. Victor Tryon and his wife Nancy Tryon, who's head of the DNA lab, said that they have now identified X and Y chromosomes on the shroud, which told them that this was male blood. And Dr. Tryon has said that he has isolated strands of DNA, small strands with some 700 base pairs of DNA, which he says is consistent with the supposition of ancient blood. He said, I can't tell you that it was Jesus' blood, I can't tell you the date, but I can say that what I'm looking at is a male human blood consistent with an ancient DNA. An interesting debate kind of rose, and I guess it's just a part of our times, but questions had come up, well, could you take this blood and do something with it? Could you clone it, for example? And there was a British filmmaker threatening to make a film on cloning. This is Dr. Jennifer Smith, who's head of the FBI DNA lab in Washington, and Dr. Victor Tryon, have both said that it's kind of like a Jurassic Park fantasy, but in reality, you're dealing with a very degraded ancient DNA, and this would be, in their position, impossible. But I mention that because you may see something like that on the news. So by the time they had finished, I think the iron oxide theory just fell apart, and this was identified as a true ancient human blood, and the images were not those that would be created by an artist. So we go on. This is Dr. Adler and Dr. John Heller. I just want to point out, in some of the microscopic examination of blood charts, they found this small item here, which winds up being a piece of silver. It's actually a droplet of silver that had fallen into the fibers of the shroud. And actually, I mentioned earlier, there was a major fire in the year 1532. The fire was so intense that the reliquary in which the shroud was housed, which was also a silver reliquary, began to melt. and some droplets fell into the cloth. The significance of that, as we'll talk about a little more at the end, I just want to point it out now. The significance was that those scientists who refute the carbon theory, among other things, said that that piece of silver gave us a clue to the intensity of the fire, which would have reached a temperature of at least 960 degrees Celsius, some 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, in order for it to have melted and fallen into the shroud. Fortunately, it didn't break through enough for it to combust, and the fire was doused and the shroud was preserved. But we'll talk about that more at the end. In 1978, one of the other really fascinating breakthroughs with the shroud came when Dr. John Jackson and Dr. Eric Jumper, who's now at Notre Dame, both physicists at the Air Force Academy at the time, were working with an instrument created by NASA. Maybe you could focus that a little. At NASA, which is called a VP8 image analyzer. And the purpose of the VP8 was really used in space studies to identify items by relief and dark, light and dark, shadow, and et cetera, and it could create three-dimensional relief. Well, they took a very, very good black and white photo that had been taken of the shroud in 1931, what we call the Henri photos. And when they put the photo under the image analyzer, to really their shock, they found that the image was perfect three-dimensionality. These are fold marks, the way the shroud had been folded earlier. They saw perfect three-dimensionality that they have not been able to duplicate since with any photo or any painting. When they went a step further, if you could just go forward. When they went a step further and they began to look at the image of the face, you can see the face here, they focused in on the eyes, and they said that over the area of the eyes, they could identify what they called dense, button-like objects having a particular shape, and they suspected that it was coins, but they weren't sure at the time. So they took it to the British Museum, and they used macro photography. At first, macro photography, if you can clear that up a little bit, thank you. And notice that over both eyes, they could make out the shape of a coin, which came to be identified, and I'm jumping over a lot of information here because there's just so much I can cover, but which had the shape of a Roman lepton. The Roman lepton was a very unique coin that is mentioned in the New Testament as the widow's mite. It talks about the woman who went to the temple and Jesus was watching, and she put in these two lepta, as it's called, these two coins. It was a coin that was minted by Pilate. It was minted only between 29 and 32 AD. It was noted for its clipped area. It was noted for this astrologer's wand. And most importantly, for our purposes, around the edge of the coin, this is a pretty bad coin, but at the time were imprinted the words Tiberiu Caesaros, for Tiberius Caesar. Tiberio would have ended in a U, which looks like a Y in Greek, and Caesaros, of course, beginning with either a CAI or a KAI. So they took this and they brought it to the University of Virginia, what we call the Spatial Data Analysis Lab. And by the way, I have some of these reports up here if you want to see them, and some things on the back table. Some of these original reports, which are quite fascinating. And Dr. Robert Haralick was able to take these images, digitalize them, and study. And what he found was that when he digitalized these coin images over the right eye, he found the lettering UCAI in the corner of the coin, precisely where it would have been on the badly minted Pilate coins. They were all pretty badly minted. And it was just rather fascinating evidence that said this could never have been the work of a medieval individual. The microscope wasn't even around for a few hundred more years. Why would they do it? How would they do it? Many, many other questions. So this has always been a debate. There were those that said, well, the practice of placing coins over the eyes was not Jewish, and that is really not true. In some of the biblical or archaeological journals and whatever, there was a debate for a while. But we have now found ancient coins at Jewish burial sites. The problem is that you don't find a lot of them. And the reason you don't find a lot of them is usually because most of the tombs are ransacked before the archaeologists even get there. Coins are one of the first things. Coins and jewelry and those things usually disappear. But we have found coins, and we found them in the base of the skull, consistent with placement over the eyes, rather than, as some people said, in the mouth, where they would have appeared in the neck area. So there was a lot of evidence, and a lot of this I cover in the book. But the point is that this was just another step forward in the preponderance of evidence that we were putting together. That's just a magnification of the lettering of UCAI. One of the areas that we looked at very carefully is, and naturally we would look at, how consistent is what we see on the shroud with what we would, with what we know of ancient Jewish burial customs, because the Gospel of John, for example, makes it very clear that Jesus was buried according to the Jewish custom. A lot of work had been done. I had the honor a few years ago of going up to New York and burying myself in the Jewish Theological Library in Manhattan, just to try to verify sources. I mean, there was nothing new in what I found, but I was trying to verify for myself where were all these ancient sources in the Jewish, what we call the Mishnah and the mourning tractates and Josephus and some of the earliest historical records that we have. How would a person have been buried at the time? And in a nutshell, I can tell you that everything that we see on the shroud, from the type of cave tomb that was used, that's mentioned in the Gospels, to the type of cloths that were used, there were three types. The sindon, which is the shroud itself, the long 14-foot or so piece of cloth, the what we call orthonia, or bandages that are used to hold the wrists and the legs together, and the sudarion, which is a chin band, which was required to be used in Jewish burial to keep the mouth of the individual closed. They would tie a linen band around the face to slow down the process of decomposition, primarily. We see evidence of that. From the timing of the burial, because it was required under Jewish law that if an individual were crucified, the Romans would honor the fact that the body had to be off the cross by sundown. And everything we see in the Gospel says there was a rush to get Jesus buried before sundown by Joseph of Arimathea. Even to the question of washing or not washing the body, there were debates for a long time about was the body of Jesus washed before burial and whatever. The answer is that it was not, and that accounts for the blood transfer, because blood was still on the body. And an interesting thing is that even though Jewish law required that a body be washed before being buried, it goes on to say that if an individual was the victim of a violent death, whether it by crucifixion or murder or whatever, that the blood that flowed out at the moment of death was so sacred that they were not allowed to wash the body of an individual who had died in this manner. In fact, it goes on to say that even if blood spilled on the ground, if the family could, they would try to scoop that up with the dirt and keep it with the body. So everything that we see, as I mentioned, you recall in the New Testament talks about the fact that Joseph of Arimathea carried the body a short distance to the cave tombs. And in Jerusalem of that period, coffins were not used. They were in Jericho, but they weren't in Jerusalem. They would carve tombs into the soft limestone calcium. That's where the calcium carbonate comes from. The soft limestone of the sides of hills. There'd be a small entrance. There'd be a rolling stone, which we see in the resurrection accounts when Mary Magdalene sees that the rolling stone had been rolled back. There was a ledge where the body would be laid. There were recesses called loculi, where once the individual was prepared, they would be slid in there and the body would remain there for a year. Even the lay of the body, for example, when you look at the shroud, the hands are laid out, it's actually left over right over the midsection. And some people said, no, the burials would be this way. But all the burials that we find in Qumran and other Jewish cemeteries but you see that the bodies were laid out with hands over the midsection. So there is a definite consistency with all the aspects of Jewish burial that we've looked at. Now, when it gets to the area of the actual crucifixion, something that Dr. Lawrence mentioned earlier, to me, one of the most fascinating areas is that you can't really study the shroud and walk away without having a very deep appreciation of the passion and the death, and ultimately the resurrection, which we'll talk about later. And in studying the pathology, if you will, of the shroud, there have been a number of pathologists and surgeons who have studied the shroud imagery in the past few years. And I'll just use two to talk about their assessment of it. One is Dr. Frederick Zugabe, who was the medical examiner in Rockland, New York, and has written extensively on the shroud. And Dr. Robert Buckland, who is currently a deputy medical examiner in Las Vegas, also written extensively on the medical pathology of the shroud. And what they said is when we study the medical aspects of the shroud, one of the things that we're looking for is what we call the signature of Roman crucifixion as it applies to the historical Jesus. Because if we say that this is an ancient cloth, if we say that there's ancient blood and pollen and many other areas, one of the logical questions, well, how do we know this would be the image of the historical Jesus and maybe not someone else that had been crucified at that period? And so we look to the pathology of the shroud in many ways to answer some of these questions. So they have broken it into 4 areas. And what they're looking for is, can you identify the words, the weapons, and the wounds? The words of the New Testament, the kinds of wounds that we find on the shroud, and the kinds of weapons that might have been used. And is there a consistency that would tell us that somehow this is related to the historical Jesus of Nazareth? So they break it into 4 areas. The first area that they analyzed was that we know from the markings on the body that this individual had suffered a very, very severe scourging. And from their analysis, the body would have had severe scourging from the back of the calves to the top of the neck, and would probably have been done by either 2 individuals, one on either side, or one person that changed positions, because the markings fan out this way across the back from 2 sides. They can also tell you that the weapon that was used is what we call a Roman flagrum, of which we now have archaeological examples. But the flagrum was a whip consisting of a leather handle with 3 leather thongs, and at the end of them would be an hourglass-shaped piece of bone or lead, so that when you hit an individual with the flagrum, it would leave roughly 6 marks. And if you just go forward, please. When they overlaid, this is the back of the head, by the way. That's the sole of the left foot. When it's left because this is a reverse image, don't forget. They could see the markings of the shroud laid out from 2 different directions that marked precisely the kinds of markings that we would find from the Roman patibulum. The Roman flagrum. So that was one of the first areas, and they could estimate that there were about 600 lash marks, which would represent about 100 lashes. So it's a very, very severe scourging with welts and contusions and whatever. The second area, which starts to get more into the signature, was what we call the capping of thorns. And they call it a capping of thorns versus a crown of thorns because we traditionally think of a circle of thorns around the head. But the indication is more that it was a cap pressed onto the back of the head, which penetrated a little bit on the forehead. And as Dr. Buckland can tell you, you can see the weave of the shroud in here. He said that one of the things that struck him in studying the blood images on the shroud was that the whole idea of venal versus arterial blood flow was not identified, I think, until 1539 by Andrea Celespino. And he says that he can identify the difference between arterial and venal blood flow in different areas of the shroud, which is something that a medieval anatomist, if there even was any real anatomist, would have known. He said also he can see directionality of blood flow. Some of the images, some of the blood flows to the left, some of it flows to the right, which he felt was very consistent with the tilting of the head on the cross. Let me see if there was something else I wanted to mention with the blood. Oh, to get back to the signature, in all of our records of ancient crucifixion, whether from Josephus or from the Jewish historian Josephus or the Roman historian Tacitus and many others, we never find a record of anyone who had been crowned with thorns except for Jesus. And the interesting part about that is that from a legal aspect, when Jesus was first arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and brought before the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish high court, the original charge that was made against him was blasphemy, because he had said, if you destroy this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. To the Jews of that period, looking at the temple of Herod, this is something only God could do, but of course Jesus was talking about himself. The point being that because the Sanhedrin, because Palestine was really under Roman occupation, Jewish law could not condemn a person to death, so they had to be turned over to the Roman court. When he was turned over to the Roman court, the charge of blasphemy held no strength in a Roman court. So the charge was changed to treason, and the charge was treason because he said he was a king. And if you recall, Pilate was interrogating Jesus and asked him if he was really a king, and Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. The point being that the crowning of thorns was a mockery of his kingship, of him saying he was a king, and that's one of the real identifiers that we see of the capping of thorns. Okay? The third area really gets into the actual crucifixion and the nailing, which was really a very severe. We often think of Jesus as carrying a cross in the traditional sense of a T. In reality, the Roman method of crucifixion, there were several ways, but as we best see it in the Gospels, is that they would leave the upright in position. It would be pretty stationary. It would be in the upright, would be right outside the city gates as kind of a warning to those coming in not to participate in insurrections. But the individual would then be asked to carry, or made to carry, a beam called a patibulum. And the beam maybe weighed 50 pounds or so. And we see on the back of the shroud, as Dr. Zugabe and Buckland point out, they can see, that's the back of the head, and that's you see the capping of thorns. But they can see chafing marks on the upper left shoulder and lower right, I guess, scapular area that overrode the whip marks, which showed that something was either carried or whatever after the scourging, which they say was consistent with the beam, although we can't prove it. When they went a step further, I guess in the mid-30s, late 30s, a French surgeon by the name of Dr. Pierre Barbet had, he was a real advocate of the shroud, and he had done studies on the nailing. And he said that, in his opinion, when he studied the shroud, he said that from the point of view of a surgeon, he said, there's no way that a nail placed in the palm of the hand could hold an individual on the cross. It would just tear it right through. And he said it just seemed logical to him that the nail wounds would have had to be in the high palm or the lower forearm in an area that he calls the space of Destow, I guess an area where 7 carpal bones come together and there's a tunnel. And he said that when he studied the shroud, he noticed that the wound seemed very consistent with a wound in the upper palm or lower wrist than it did with the center of the palm. He also noticed, and Zugabe and Buckland support him in this, is that when you look at the shroud, a curious phenomenon, you do not see any thumbs. You see the left hand over the right, you just don't see any thumbs. And they said that would be a phenomenon which would occur if there were damage to the median nerve of the hand. Buckland says in his experience when he's seen these kinds of wounds, it immediately draws the thumb into the palm. Just a reflex reaction, I guess. And someone had said to me at one point, well, in the New Testament when it talks about Thomas, for example, doubting that Jesus had risen and he's with the apostles, And he says, unless I put my finger into the wound in the hand where the nail was and touch his side, I'm not going to believe. So they said there, it says hand. But in reality, in biblical Greek, there's only one word for hand and wrist. It's chier, C-H-E-I-R, transliterated. And so it could be translated wrist, it could be translated hand. It was not making that kind of distinction. This is an interesting, I just point this out, in 1968 in Israel, they found a grave of an individual who had been crucified in the year 6 AD, named Jehohanan. And the significance of that find, just kind of an interesting side note, is that it was the only crucifixion where we have found a nail buried with the actual person. Nails were taken as amulets by Roman soldiers and whatever. But anyway, because this was embedded in a piece of olive wood, I guess they just left it in the tomb. The point is that when they took the body and reconstructed the hand and the arm, they found that the nail had been through the base of the forearm where the radius and the ulnar bones come together because of the scratch marks that they found on the bone. So it just kind of reinforced that the Romans would likely have nailed higher up to sustain a body on the cross. Just a recap of a couple of things. When you look at the front image, you see this break here in the blood flow. That, we believe, was the result of the placement of these linen cloths, which are called orthonia in the New Testament, that held the wrists together so that the body could be carried on a litter, or whether it was a litter or not, we don't know. But the body could be carried to the tomb. You also notice that there's a directionality, two directions to the flow of blood from the wrist, and there's direction of blood down the forearm in two different directions following the flow of gravity, number one. But if you were to take the arm in this position and do that with it, you would find that those two flows are downward in two different directions. And as the pathologist will point out, that's very consistent with two positions on the cross. The only way, according to Zugabe, that Jesus could have survived as long as he did was to push himself up in order to breathe, and then out of exhaustion collapse. And then, of course, then he couldn't breathe. Excuse me. So the flow of gravity was very consistent with the change of position on the cross. The fourth area that they point out, which is another one of these signatures that we talked about, is the lancing in the side. And this is a standard Roman lance, which is basically 4 centimeters by 1 centimeter, and would create a kind of an elliptical wound. And this is a patch, so just disregard. That's a patch from the fire of 1532. But this whole area is blood and serum. And we see a wound mark which they say would have been between the 5th and 6th ribs. Well, the significance of this is really very interesting. If you recall, in the New Testament, it says that Jesus had died at the 9th hour, which would be 3 o'clock our time. They did have to get his body off the cross by sundown. It was a very strict rule. And sundown might be 2.5, 3 hours away. The Romans did allow for Jews to remove the body and bury it by sundown. But Joseph of Arimathea had to go to Pilate. He had to ask for permission to remove the body. And Pilate was surprised that Jesus had died and sent the centurion back, who, it says, broke the legs of the other 2 individuals, but when he got to Jesus, saw that he was already dead, so he lanced him in the side, and out came blood and water. Well, there's a lot of things in there, but they're very interesting things. First of all, the Romans, to respect this need to have the body off the cross by sundown, had a practice which they call crucifragium. Crucifragium simply meant that if the individual was not dead by sundown, they would break their legs, to break their shin bones to hasten death, because then they couldn't breathe, they couldn't raise themselves up. It's a very cruel practice in one way, but we know from the Shroud the legs were not broken, which is certainly consistent with what the Gospels tell us. The other thing that's interesting is that it says that out came blood and water. Well, for many years, in the fathers of the church and whatever, That was always interpreted kind of mystically as meaning baptism of blood from the martyrs, baptism of water from baptism itself. But the pathologists saw in an additional way, not contradicting that other way, but what they said was that Jesus would have been experiencing a very severe pleural edema, as they put it. And there would have been fluids building up around the pericardial sac and the lungs and whatever, and this would separate clear serum from blood, so that if he were lanced at that point, they would see serum, which they would say would be water and blood. On the back of the shroud, as you'll see shortly, when the body was laid horizontal, that blood serum flowed all the way across the back. You can see a whole trail of blood and serum across the back. So that's again one of the signatures that tell us there's only one person in all of recorded history, apart from the historical pedigree where we can trace the shroud back historically, that fits this scenario, and that would be the historical Jesus of Nazareth. So now we begin to link that ancient cloth with Jesus, with the ancient blood, with the pollen, with the coins, and a number of other things. I want to also mention that Dr. Zugerbe said a very fascinating thing, a very moving thing, I think, at the conference a few months ago. He said that he had been a student of the Shroud for 50 years, 50 years. And he has a PhD in anatomy, apart from being a forensic pathologist who testifies in cases all over the country. And he said, if I, meaning him, had to write the death certificate of Jesus right now, I would say that he died of a traumatic shock combined with what he called a hypovolemic shock. I don't presume to understand all of it, I'm telling you what he said. And he said, and that all of would have resulted in a cardiogenic shock or a heart failure. Some said he died of asphyxia. He says he would have died of shock. And it was a very moving statement coming from someone who had studied it for so many years. The passion itself really came to light. When you see the shroud in person, this is basically what it looks like. You see the off-color ivory from 2,000 years of exposure. And you see these sepia images, which I said are created by the discoloration of the cellulose fibers. But you see you see this break around the face, if you can notice that. That, we believe, is the chin band that broke the imagery that held the mouth closed. You see these owl-like eyes. The eyes are really closed, but they do have coins over them. There's a mark on the forehead that we call the epsilon mark. It looks like the Greek epsilon 3, reverse 3, which was a thorn that would have pierced the forehead and followed the furrowing of the brow. You see, that's a water stain, that stain right there. You see the marks on the hands and down, down the wrists, down the forearms, I should say. No thumbs. It's a little hard to make out. The feet are not there. These are patch marks from the fire of 1532. This is a scorch mark from the way the cloth was folded. On the back of the shroud, an interesting thing that was discovered. This is the capping of thorns on the back of the head. It's a little hard to make out on this shroud, but there's a dark line which has now been identified as a braid of hair, very consistent with Jewish male styles of that period. It's a braid of hair down the center. You can see the scourge marks on the back. This is the flow of blood and serum across the small of the back, coming from the lance wound in the side. And you can't see it, but there's blood on the sole of the foot. Thank you. Okay. That's the sole of the left foot, and there's blood coming off. It was truly a passion. Now, I want to just say a couple of things quickly about some history, because I have like 2 chapters of history, but I picked out 3 short items just to give you a feel for the fact that there is a historical pedigree here. And the most interesting one, well, I won't say the most interesting, but one of the clearest ones comes from this image, which is from the 10th century. This is called the image of Abgar, and just a kind of a personal story. I used this as the cover of my book, if you see my book in the back. And when I wanted to use this image, because it said so much, I called a colleague of mine at Duke University, Dr. Alan Wanger, and asked him where I could find it, and he said, here's what you do. You write a letter to Archbishop Damianos of Mount St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert. And just write Archbishop Damianos, Mount St. Catherine's, Sinai. And I said, to me that was like Santa Claus, North Pole. This is never, ever going to get there. But I did what he told me. I wrote the letter. And about 6 weeks later, I guess, I was sitting here at Palm Harbor at my computer at 7 o'clock in the morning, and my fax machine went on, and out comes this letter, and I'm reading it upside down. It's Archbishop Damianos, Mount St. Catherine's, and I'm imagining this monk in the middle of the Sinai Desert, the foot of where Moses gave the Ten Commandments, sending me a fax. And I just thought, it's very fascinating. You're saying you can use this image. The interesting thing about this image is that for 1,200 years from the earliest church up to the year 1204, basically, the Greek Byzantine church had the legend of King Abgar, and it's written up by some of the most prestigious Christian historians like Eusebius and Evagrius and John Damascene and others. And they talk about Abgar. Abgar was a king. In reality, he was a king who was a contemporary of Jesus, and he ruled over the kingdom of Edessa. And when the Oxford historian Ian Wilson first discovered this, he said, gee, Edessa, that's where Max Fry had found all these pollen from the second area that we really didn't understand at the time. And Eusebius talks about how Abgar knew of the ministry of Jesus, asked Jesus to come to Edessa. Jesus told him that he could not during his lifetime, but that after his death, he would send something that would cure him of his leprosy. Eusebius and Evagrius and others go on to say that what he did send him was a cloth bearing the image of Jesus, a linen cloth bearing the image of Jesus, which the Greeks for 1,200 years called the akeiropoietas, which means the image not made by human hands. And it was revered. The whole history of the Greek Byzantine church talks about this image. It's really quite fascinating when you get into the history of it. But to go on, the story goes on to say that after the death of Abgar, his grandson took over and began to persecute the early church in Edessa in maybe 150 BC, AD. And it says that to protect this cloth, it was walled up in the walls of Edessa, which was a very dry climate anyway, and not rediscovered until about the year 550. This is the court historians from Constantinople talking about it. Well, the interesting part about that takes us to the next slide. If you can just clean that up a little bit. For the first few hundred years, when you get into early Christian art, and this slide was presented by Dr. Heinrich Pfeiffer, who's one of the world's leading authorities on early Christian art. He said that for several hundred years, with the exception of one of the very earliest frescoes in one of the very earliest catacombs of Domitilla in Rome, the images of Jesus all become very Apollo-like, that he is pictured as a young man with no beard, no mustache, short hair, usually pictured in profile, although here it's frontal, and usually as a teacher and a shepherd. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the 6th century, simultaneous with the rediscovery of the cloth of Edessa in the walls, the images of Jesus all over the empire change. This is from the monastery of St. Catherine in the 6th century. Jesus all of a sudden has the long hair, the mustache, the beard, these owl-like eyes, because they wouldn't have known what they were looking at with these large eyes. And if you go to the next slide, these are the consistent images in Rome, in Constantinople, in Athens, and whatever. Without going into a lot of detail here, I'll just mention this. One of the historians of the Shroud, Paul Vignon, identified some 16 points of consistency among all these with the Shroud, these very odd marks over the forehead, the owl-like eyes, which again they would not have known really what, the long hair, the mustache, the beard, and a number of other factors. But it told us that with the rediscovery of this cloth, it was used as the model then for an image that had been lost sight of. No one really knew what Jesus looked like. And the last little piece of history that I'll mention, and there's many of them, but I'm just focusing on a couple of things. The Greeks, in about the middle of the 6th century, started talking about this cloth, which they called the tetradiplon. And tetradiplon is a made-up Greek word, which means doubled in 4. And it's only used 2 times in the history of Greek Byzantine theology in the first 12 centuries, both in relation to this cloth. And what they were saying was that the cloth, which when you see it, you saw Abgar holding the cloth, which just showed the face. If you took the shroud and for manageability alone, and doubled it in 4, you create 8 panels with 7 crease marks, and only the face appears. And throughout the history, it was folded in this manner. Actually, it's been folded a number of ways since, but in 1978, when Dr. John Jackson was, among others, were doing the STIRP test, they subjected the shroud to what they called a raking light test, where they spread it out on a large board held with magnets, and they used light beams to try to determine any kind of ancient crease marks. And they found the 7 marks, which were identical with the tetradiplon. Actually, there were more marks in the center because when it was folded and refolded, it changed slightly. But he said there's no question that this would be identical to what the Greeks called the tetradiplon. Let me just very briefly say something about the carbon-14. So most of you probably understand this, but I won't assume that you do. Carbon-14 is basically a test discovered in the 50s, used by Dr. William Libby at the time. And it basically was predicated on the fact that all living organisms contain within them a balance between carbon-12, which is a stable atom, and carbon-14, which is an unstable isotope. And they exist in a certain ratio if they participate in the food chain. So anything that was alive or is alive somehow contains this ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14. Since the shroud is made of linen, it was presumed that the flax plant then would have the same balance of carbon-14 and carbon-12, and that as soon as the individual died and stopped participating in the food chain, the carbon-12 would basically be stable, the carbon-14 would begin to decay at a certain rate called its half-life, which was like 5,720 years, would lose half of its carbon-14. So they felt they could measure this rate of change, and unfortunately at the time, although a number of scientists had warned that this was a dangerous test when applied to linen because there was too many contaminants involved, the world press picked up and went in the direction that, well, this was the only test that really made sense. Well, since that time, what has happened is questions have arisen. The first thing that we presented them with was, of course, the one at the time, which was that the preponderance of evidence said there was more involved in this than just this one test. So why do you take one test and throw out all the others? Why not put them in balance and look at the preponderance? That was the first approach, but that didn't work with the world press. But what's happened in the last few years, I think, is the most encouraging, and that has been that it really has focused on what the carbon scientists themselves have come to realize, namely that they are having very consistent problems with the dating of linen as opposed to many, many other objects. So just as an example, in 1986, they did a test with an Egyptian bull mummy, where they took a mummy with a known date of 3000 BC, and they separated the linen from the mummy, cleaned the linen according to the carbon cleaning methods, and when they dated it, they found that the linen was 1,500 years younger than the mummy that it wrapped. And that didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. So they said, this is an anomaly. Well, a short while later, in England, Dr. Rosalie David, who's an Egyptologist, was doing a similar test on an Egyptian mummy that's called Mummy 1770. And she did the same thing. She found the same thing. She found that when the wrappings were separated from the mummy, she was getting about a 1,000-year discrepancy between her wrappings and her mummy, with the linen appearing to be younger. And still that wasn't enough. But last year, Dr. Harry Gove, who's one of the co-inventors of the unit that measures carbon, it's called the accelerated mass spectrometer, agreed to do a test at Arizona, which was one of the labs that did the Shroud. And he worked with Rosalie David and Dr. Garza Valdez, and they took an Egyptian ibis mummy and came up with the same results. They had about a 600-year discrepancy where the linen was younger than the mummy. And that's the first time that I remember hearing the carbon scientists say, maybe we were wrong, because for a while it was almost comical. They were calling those people who believed in the Shroud flat earthers. They would call us flat earthers for believing in the Shroud when carbon said this. But anyway, the question then changed to, well, if there were these consistent discrepancies with linen, what could account for that? And there's basically three, in wrapping this up there are three theories that are prominent today. And I should tell you also that I've had the really good fortune in the last month or so of contacting Dr. Thomas Phillips. And Dr. Thomas Phillips is a nuclear physicist who was with the Harvard High Energy Labs for 10 years. Then he was with the Fermi Accelerator Labs in Chicago, and now he's at Duke still working with Chicago. And I was talking with him, and we've been corresponding by email, and he said, I'm going to educate you, he calls it Nuclear Physics 101. So he's telling me the carbon impact on the Shroud. It's absolutely fascinating. But the question really came up, what could account for this discrepancy? And was this realistic? And the three theories which came up, the first involved the fire of 1532. It was a major fire, and I pointed out that little piece of silver that told us the temperature of that fire, among other things. And in 1994, Dr. Dmitry Kuznetsov, who's a Russian physicist, was able to obtain a piece of cloth from the Israeli Antiquities Authority. It was dated between 100 AD, 100 BC. It had a known date. What he did was he recreated a fire model by duplicating the fire of 1532, the conditions of that fire, the temperature, the dousing with water, all those things. And he said that the conclusion was that it created a very serious discrepancy in the dating because the fire, in his opinion, caused what he calls carboxylation. It caused an adding of carbon isotopes to the Shroud. When you do that, you kind of rejuvenate the linen. It appears younger than it was because you're reversing the process. Some scientists said, well, makes sense, but there's not enough there to account for a 1,300-year discrepancy. And that's a big debate, so we leave to the carbon people. But the second thing that came up was discovered at the University of Texas by Dr. Garza Valdez, and he was studying Mayan artifacts. And he kept noticing, having nothing to do with the Shroud, he kept noticing that on these artifacts, he kept seeing this kind of a coating on the surface, a sheen, which he identified eventually as he calls it a bioplastic coating. And it was created because he kept finding these colonies of fungus and bacteria. Lichenothelia is the fungus and Rhodococcus is the bacteria. And he says when they work together in a kind of a symbiotic relationship, they leave a bioplastic coating on the on the surfaces of these vases or whatever he was studying. So he asked for permission to go to Turin, which he got, and he examined some of the fibers that were removed in the 1988 test. There was a fourth sample set aside for other testing. And he said, there it is, on the coating, on the fibers of the Shroud, we can identify today this bioplastic coating. There was, at some point in its history, there was the introduction of this fungus and bacteria, and he showed, and the carbon scientists at first said, no, this can't be because we would have cleaned that when we did our cleaning of the, in the protocol and preparation for the test. But he showed them no, because number one, you didn't know what you were looking at. You were looking through it. It's a clear coating on these fibers. Number two, it does not come off with the cleansing process. So A number of the carbon scientists say now they have seen the bioplastic coating, and yes, it would affect carbon-14 because in essence, they're dating the colonies of bacteria as much as they're dating the linen. They're not getting at the pure linen. Now, Dr. Phillips, to me, has really one of the most fascinating theories. He said that in addition to those possible cumulative effects, he said that, you know, as a nuclear physicist, he has to separate his science from his faith. But he says when he looks at the shroud and he tries to understand the imaging, what actually created this image, because we've ruled out pretty much all the natural theories. There was a theory prevalent in the 60s and 70s that the imagery was created naturally from the sweat and ammonia and the heat and everything, that it created a vapor. It was called the vaporgraph theory, that it transferred this image onto linen. And you can transfer a very crude image onto linen with certain types of vapors. But as the scientist that studied it with Sturb said, but that's not the answer to this, because number one, those vapors diffuse. They don't create an identifiable image in that way. Two, they penetrate, they saturate, they go into the fibers, which we know this did not. Three, they don't account for coin images and other off-body images. And fourthly, we have so many hundreds of burial cloths around the world in our museums, not one of which has an image. We find bloodstains, we find decomposition, we find serum, but we don't find anything in image. So if this was such a natural process, we'd expect to see it somewhere else. So they said, his position is that, he said, separating my faith from my science, that if in fact there were a resurrection and you accept that, and if in fact this cloth was historically in touch with the body of Jesus at the moment of resurrection, which I hope to demonstrate in my book and as we've talked to you tonight, then something happened in that tomb in those 36 hours that left these images that nobody can explain. And he said, in his opinion, the images, and there are a number of physicists who now agree with him, are consistent with a milliburst of radiation that, if you accept the resurrection, most likely came from the body of Jesus at the moment of the resurrection, and basically imprinted this surface image. And it's an awesome theory. I mean, it gives you the chills when you think about it. And he said that, if my scientific friends think that I'm crazy, he said, just consider for the moment the fact that we have never had a resurrection to study before, so how do we know what would have happened? And he said, he points to the Gospel of St. John, and where it talks of the morning of the resurrection. And it says that, Mary Magdalene went out to the tomb early in the morning, saw that the stone had been rolled back, assumed the body had been stolen, ran back to Peter and John and said, they've taken the body of our master. And it says, John and Peter ran out to the tomb. John got there first, waited for Peter. They looked in and saw the linens that had been on the body lying there, and the cloth that had been around his head folded to one side. Then it says they went in, and John saw, and he believed. And the question that biblical scholars will bring up, some of them, will say, well, what exactly did he see that made him believe? Because he knew the body was gone, even from the first moment. And of course, the speculation is that he would have seen these images. I think it's a fascinating theory. And what Dr. Phillips told me is that there is one way to demonstrate whether, he said, I'm not saying that that's what happened. He said, it's consistent with what he calls a neutron flux, and he says if they can do certain other testings on the shroud, such as identify, he calls it calcium-41 and chlorine-36, it would prove that there was this neutron flux. So that's one of the things we're working on with the Vatican. But anyway, I think it's fascinating, and it certainly gives you pause to think. And I recall I gave a talk recently at a Lutheran church here in Palm Harbor, and the Lutheran pastor came up to me afterwards and he said, I've been studying the Gospel of John for years. That's the first time I ever really think I understood what it was that John saw that made him believe. And with that, you draw your own conclusions, but I think that the preponderance of evidence clearly shows this was an ancient cloth, and this was in fact the cloth that covered the body of Jesus at the moment of resurrection.